Welcome back. Tonight, we journey eastward, into a land once bound by honor, but ripped apart by war. This is medieval Japan, not the quiet serenity of cherry blossoms and tea ceremonies, but a time when samurai clans clashed in endless cycles of betrayal, ambition, and blood. Lords fell overnight. Villages vanished by morning. The air hung heavy with ash, and survival often meant submission or steel. This isn't the stylized version you've seen in anime or films. This is the chaos behind the katana, where the line between warrior and war criminal was often blurred. If this kind of raw, unfiltered history helps lull you into sleep or sparks your late-night curiosity, consider liking or subscribing, only if it feels right to you. I'm always fascinated to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. There's something strangely soothing in knowing that people around the world are falling asleep to the same ancient echoes. So get comfortable, let the world fade a little, and allow yourself to drift into the distant thunder of war drums and whispered loyalties. This is history, the kind that never made it into textbooks. In the year 1467, as cherry blossoms drifted through the humid air of Kyoto, the emperor's capital had become a stage for the opening act of what would become Japan's longest and most brutal period of warfare. The sweet fragrance of spring flowers mingled with the acrid smoke rising from burning temples, creating an atmosphere both beautiful and ominous that would define an entire era. Imagine yourself standing in the courtyard of the imperial palace, where the polished wooden floors once reflected the silk robes of courtiers in peaceful times. Now those same halls echoed with the urgent whispers of nervous officials and the distant clash of steel against steel. The Unin War had begun, though few understood then that this conflict would shatter the very foundations of Japanese society and usher in more than a century of continuous warfare known as the Sengoku period, the Age of Warring States. The Japan of 1467 was a land caught between two worlds. For centuries, the emperor had ruled in name while real power rested with the Ashikaga shogunate, a military government that maintained order through a complex web of loyalty and obligation. Yet this system, like an ancient wooden bridge weakened by countless seasons of rain and snow, was beginning to creak and sway under pressures both seen and unseen. The rhythm of their lives, once as predictable as the changing seasons, was about to be disrupted forever. In the provinces beyond Kyoto's influence, local lords called daimyo had grown increasingly powerful, their private armies expanding like bamboo groves after summer rain. These warriors, bound by codes of honor and personal loyalty, controlled vast estates where peasants worked rice paddies that stretched like mirrors across the landscape. The daimyo's wooden castles, perched on hilltops and surrounded by earthen walls, served as both fortress and administrative center for domains that operated almost like independent kingdoms. The sound of wooden sandals on stone pathways marked the daily processions of samurai retainers as they moved through castle towns that had grown around these fortified centers. These settlements bustled with activity from dawn until dusk, blacksmiths hammering red-hot iron into sword blades, merchants hawking silk and tea, and farmers bringing their harvest to market. The air was thick with the scent of cooking rice, incense from nearby shrines, and the ever-present aroma of wet earth that characterized Japan's humid climate. Yet beneath this apparent prosperity lay tensions that ran as deep as the roots of the ancient cedar trees that dotted the landscape. The question of succession had divided the Ashikaga family, creating two rival claimants to the position of shogun. Like a stone thrown into a still pond, this dispute sent ripples throughout the entire feudal hierarchy. Powerful daimyo chose sides not based on principle or justice, but on calculations of advantage and survival that would determine the fate of their families for generations to come. The Hosokawa and Yamana clans, two of the most powerful families in Japan, found themselves on opposite sides of this succession dispute. Their rivalry transformed what might have been a brief political crisis into a devastating war that would consume the capital and spread throughout the archipelago. Warriors who had once shared sake and poetry now faced each other across battle lines drawn through the very heart of Kyoto, their ancestral codes of honor twisted into justifications for betrayal and bloodshed. As spring turned to summer in that fateful year, the streets of Kyoto became battlegrounds where neighbor fought neighbor and brother turned against brother. The elegant wooden architecture that had stood for centuries, temples with their curved roofs reaching toward heaven, aristocratic mansions with their carefully tended gardens, all became fuel for the fires of war. The smoke that rose from these burning structures carried with it the ashes of the old order, dispersing on the wind like the last remnants of a dying dream. In the rural provinces, news of the capital's turmoil traveled slowly along mountain paths and river valleys, carried by merchants, monks, and wandering warriors. Local lords watched and waited, calculating how the distant conflict might affect their own domains. Some saw opportunity in the chaos, a chance to expand their territory or settle old scores with neighboring rivals. Others prepared for defense, knowing that the collapse of central authority would soon unleash forces that had been contained for generations. The common people, farmers, artisans, and traders, went about their daily tasks with growing unease. They had lived their entire lives under a system that, while harsh and hierarchical, provided a measure of predictability and protection. Now, as news of battles and betrayals filtered through their communities, they began to understand that their world was changing in ways that would touch every aspect of their existence. The rhythm of their lives, once synchronized with the agricultural calendar and religious festivals, was being disrupted by the irregular drumbeat of war. In Buddhist monasteries scattered throughout the mountains, monks who had devoted their lives to contemplation and prayer found themselves forced to consider more worldly matters. These religious communities, many of which controlled vast estates and possessed considerable wealth, could not remain neutral in the conflicts that were erupting around them. Some monasteries began training their younger members in the arts of war, while others formed alliances with local daimyo for protection. The line between spiritual and temporal power, already blurred in medieval Japan, was becoming increasingly indistinct. The Unin War would rage for 11 years, transforming Kyoto from a center of culture and refinement into a scarred landscape of burned temples and abandoned palaces. Yet this conflict was merely the prelude to an even greater period of upheaval. As central authority collapsed entirely, Japan fragmented into dozens of independent domains, each ruled by ambitious lords who recognized no authority beyond their own strength and cunning. The stage was set for the Sengoku period proper, an era when survival would depend not on birthright or tradition, but on adaptability, ruthlessness, and the ability to forge new forms of loyalty in a world where old certainties had crumbled like autumn leaves. The peasants working in the rice fields during those early years of conflict could not have imagined that their children and grandchildren would witness the rise of figures like Oda Nobunaga, men who would reshape Japan through a combination of military genius, technological innovation, and sheer force of will. Nor could they have foreseen that the chaos consuming their world would ultimately give birth to new forms of warrior culture, new military technologies, and new ways of organizing society that would define Japan for centuries to come. The age of endless war had begun, and with it, the transformation of an entire civilization. By 1477, As the Unin War finally sputtered to an exhausted conclusion, Kyoto lay in ruins like a garden after a devastating typhoon. The elegant capital that had once been the jewel of Japanese civilization now resembled a collection of broken teeth, with blackened temple foundations and collapsed palace walls marking where centuries of culture had been consumed by flame and fury. The emperor remained in his compound, but his authority extended no further than a sparrow's flight from his palace gates. In the provinces, a new breed of warrior was emerging from the ashes of the old order. Imagine yourself traveling the mountain roads of central Honshu in those years immediately following the Great War, your feet finding purchase on paths worn smooth by countless pilgrims and merchants. The landscape itself seemed to reflect the political fragmentation of the realm. Valleys isolated by towering peaks, rivers that served as natural boundaries between emerging domains, and forests so dense that entire armies could disappear into their green depths. Each mountain pass might lead to a different lord's territory, each river crossing guarded by warriors whose loyalty belonged to no distant shogun, but to the man who could provide them with rice, weapons, and the promise of victory. The daimyo who survived this initial period of chaos shared certain qualities that would define the entire Sengoku era. They were pragmatists who understood that survival required constant adaptation, men who could shift alliances as easily as a farmer rotated crops. Yet beneath their calculating exteriors lay a burning ambition that transcended mere local power. Many harbored dreams of conquering all Japan, of becoming the shogun who would reunify the fractured realm under a single banner. In the province of Kai, nestled among mountains that touched the clouds, Takeda Shingen was transforming his ancestral domain into a military powerhouse that would become legendary throughout Japan. The Takeda lands were harsh and unforgiving, with rocky soil that yielded modest harvests and winters that could trap unwary travelers in avalanches of snow. Yet these challenging conditions bred warriors of exceptional toughness and loyalty, men who understood that their survival depended entirely on their lord's ability to lead them to victory against better-equipped enemies. Shingen's innovations in cavalry warfare would revolutionize Japanese military tactics. Where other lords relied on foot soldiers armed with spears and bows, he developed mounted units that could strike with the speed of lightning and disappear into the mountains before enemy forces could respond. The thunder of hooves on hard-packed earth became the signature sound of Takeda power, a rhythm that would echo across battlefields for decades to come. His red-armored horsemen, their banners streaming behind them like crimson clouds, became a sight that could inspire terror in enemy ranks and unshakable confidence in allied forces. The rhythm of their lives in Takeda territory revolved around constant preparation for war. Villages that had once focused solely on rice cultivation now spent equal time training with weapons and maintaining the horses that were essential to their lord's military strategy. Children grew up learning to ride almost before they could walk properly, and the sound of wooden practice swords clacking together became as common as the songs of rice planting season. The mountain air rang with the calls of drill sergeants and the neighing of war horses, creating a symphony of martial preparation that never truly ceased. Meanwhile, in the eastern provinces, another future legend was taking his first steps toward power. Yusuji Kenshin, known in his youth as Negao Kagetora, ruled from the snow country domain of Ekigo, where winter storms could bury entire villages and the growing season was brief but intense. Unlike Shingen's pragmatic approach to warfare, Kenshin would develop a reputation for fighting not merely for territorial gain, but for what he perceived as righteous causes, a trait that would make him both feared and respected throughout Japan. Kenshin's domain produced some of the finest warriors in all Japan, men hardened by the constant struggle against nature's extremes. The heavy snows that blanketed Echigo for half the year created a natural fortress that few enemies dared to assault. But they also forced the population to develop exceptional discipline and cooperation simply to survive. When spring finally melted the snow barriers, Kenshin's forces would emerge like wolves after a long winter, lean and hungry for combat. The administrative innovations that emerged during this period reflected the practical needs of lords who could no longer rely on traditional sources of authority. Detailed land surveys became essential tools for maximizing agricultural output and military recruitment. Castle towns expanded rapidly as lords concentrated their populations for better defense and more efficient resource management. The sound of construction, hammers striking nails, saws cutting timber, and oxen hauling stone, became a constant backdrop to daily life as each domain raced to fortify itself against its neighbors. In these emerging castle towns, new social dynamics began to take shape. Samurai who had once lived scattered throughout the countryside now found themselves concentrated in urban environments, creating a warrior class that was simultaneously more disciplined and more isolated from the common people they served. The rigid hierarchy that characterized Japanese society began to crystallize during this period, with clear distinctions emerging between the warrior class, the farmers who supported them, and the artisans and merchants who served their material needs. The Buddhist monasteries that dotted the landscape found themselves forced to adapt to this new reality of constant warfare. Some, like the warrior monks of Mount Hai near Kyoto, became military powers in their own right, fielding armies that could rival those of secular lords. The rhythmic chanting of sutras was often interrupted by the clash of steel as monks trained in the martial arts between their religious duties. These religious warriors, known as Sohei, would play crucial roles in the conflicts to come, their spiritual discipline translating into formidable fighting abilities. The common people watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and dread. They understood that the old certainties, the predictable cycles of planting and harvest, the familiar faces of local officials, the sense that tomorrow would resemble today, were dissolving like morning mist before the rising sun. Yet there was also excitement in the air, a sense that extraordinary times might offer extraordinary opportunities for those brave or clever enough to seize them. Trade routes that had operated peacefully for generations now required armed escorts and careful negotiation of safe passage through multiple domains. Merchants who had once planned their journeys months in advance now had to adapt their routes daily based on the latest intelligence about which lords were at war with whom. The jingling of coins in merchant pouches was often accompanied by the reassuring weight of concealed weapons, as even civilian travelers learned that survival in this new world required constant vigilance. As these regional powers consolidated their strength, the stage was being set for conflicts that would dwarf even the destructive Unin War. The ambitions of men like Takeda Shingen and Usuji Kenshin would soon collide with those of other rising lords, creating a web of rivalries and alliances that would reshape the political landscape of Japan. The rhythm of their lives, once governed by agricultural seasons and religious festivals, was increasingly synchronized with the irregular drumbeat of military campaigns and shifting territorial boundaries. The transformation was not limited to the warrior class. Peasant farmers found themselves conscripted for military service during planting and harvest seasons, creating labor shortages that forced agricultural innovations. New crops were introduced to maximize yield from limited labor, and farming techniques were refined to accommodate the constant disruption of military campaigns. The very landscape began to change as lords commissioned vast earthworks, new roads, and strategic river diversions that would serve both military and economic purposes. By the end of the 15th century, Japan had become a patchwork of competing domains, each ruled by ambitious lords who combined traditional warrior values with innovative military and administrative techniques. The centralized authority that had characterized earlier periods was now just a memory, replaced by a dynamic system of regional powers that would define Japanese politics for the next century. The age of the great warlords had truly begun, and with it would come conflicts of unprecedented scale and intensity. The year 1543 arrived like any other autumn in the remote islands of southern Japan, with fishermen mending their nets and farmers gathering the last of the sweet potato harvest. The salt air carried the familiar scents of seaweed and drying fish, while the rhythm of waves against rocky shores provided the eternal soundtrack to island life. Yet on this particular day, as storm clouds gathered on the southern horizon, 3 Portuguese ships emerged from the mist like visitors from another world, their strange square-rigged sails and foreign crews bringing with them a technology that would transform Japanese warfare forever. Imagine yourself standing on the beach at Tanegashima, watching as these pale-skinned strangers wade ashore through the surf, their clothing soaked with spray, and their eyes wide with the wonder of reaching a land they had only heard described in the tales of distant traders. Among their possessions, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth and treated with reverence reserved for sacred objects, were a handful of matchlock firearms, weapons that would soon echo across every battlefield in Japan with a sound like thunder captured in metal tubes. The local lord, Tanegashima Tokataka, possessed the curiosity and pragmatic intelligence that characterized the most successful daimyo of his era. When the Portuguese demonstrated their arquebus by shooting at targets on the beach, the sharp crack of gunpowder and the sight of lead balls punching through wooden planks sparked an immediate understanding of the revolutionary potential of these weapons. The acrid smoke that drifted across the sand carried with it the scent of change itself, a harbinger of military transformation that would reshape the balance of power throughout the archipelago. Within months of that first demonstration, Japanese swordsmiths and metalworkers were laboring day and night to reverse engineer the Portuguese firearms. The forge fires that had once been dedicated solely to crafting katana and yari now glowed with the heat required to shape gun barrels, their orange light reflecting off the concentrated faces of craftsmen who understood they were participating in a technological revolution. The rhythmic hammering that had characterized Japanese metalworking for centuries now included new sounds. The precise boring of gun barrels and the delicate crafting of firing mechanisms that required tolerances measured in fractions of inches. The adaptation of firearms technology proceeded with a speed that astonished even the Portuguese traders who had introduced it. Japanese craftsmen possessed metallurgical skills that had been refined over centuries of sword-making, and they applied this expertise to firearm production with characteristic thoroughness and attention to detail. Within a decade, Japanese-made arquebus were not only matching the quality of their European counterparts, but surpassing them in reliability and craftsmanship. The islands that had once imported this technology were now producing weapons that European soldiers would have been proud to carry into battle. The psychological impact of firearms on traditional samurai culture created tensions that resonated through every level of Japanese society. For centuries, the warrior class had defined itself through mastery of the sword, the bow, and mounted combat, skills that required years of training and embodied the spiritual essence of the samurai way. The matchlock arquebus, by contrast, could be mastered by a peasant farmer in a matter of weeks, and its lead balls showed no respect for noble bloodlines or generations of martial training. The sharp crack of gunfire began to puncture not just armor and flesh, but the very foundations of aristocratic military privilege. Yet it was the pragmatic lords who embraced these new weapons most enthusiastically, understanding that survival in the Sengoku period required adaptation rather than adherence to romantic traditions. Takeda Shingen, despite his reputation as a master of cavalry warfare, began incorporating firearms into his military formations, training his horsemen to work in coordination with units of foot soldiers armed with arquebus. The thunder of hooves across mountain valleys was now accompanied by the irregular crackling of gunfire, creating a new kind of battlefield symphony that would characterize conflicts for generations to come. The production centers that emerged around firearm manufacturing transformed entire regions of Japan. Villages that had once focused on rice cultivation now found their economy centered on gunpowder production, with families specializing in the collection of saltpeter, the preparation of charcoal, and the dangerous mixing of explosive compounds. The acrid smell of sulfur became as common as the sweet scent of cooking rice in these communities, and children grew up learning to handle volatile chemicals with the same care their ancestors had devoted to tending silkworms. Buddhist monasteries, many of which had already adapted to the military realities of the Sengoku period, proved to be among the most enthusiastic adopters of firearm technology. The warrior monks of Ishiyama Honganji and other temple complexes understood that their survival depended on matching the military capabilities of secular lords who viewed religious institutions as potential threats to their authority. The sound of morning prayers was increasingly accompanied by firearms drill, as monks learned to balance spiritual discipline with the practical requirements of gunpowder warfare. The tactical innovations that emerged from the marriage of traditional Japanese military doctrine with firearms technology created new forms of battlefield organization that would influence military thinking throughout East Asia. The Ashigaru, or foot soldiers, who had previously served primarily as support troops for mounted samurai, now became the backbone of Japanese armies. These common soldiers, often recruited from farming communities, found themselves elevated to new levels of importance as their firearms gave them the ability to bring down mounted warriors who had previously been nearly invulnerable. Castle design evolved rapidly to accommodate the new realities of gunpowder warfare. The wooden palisades and earthen walls that had characterized earlier fortifications were reinforced with stone and redesigned to minimize exposure to firearms. The geometric precision required for effective gun ports and bastions introduced mathematical concepts into Japanese military architecture, creating fortresses that combined traditional Japanese aesthetic principles with cutting-edge military engineering. The sound of stonemasons working with unprecedented precision became a constant background noise in domains where lords were racing to upgrade their defensive capabilities. The supply chains required to maintain armies equipped with firearms created new forms of economic organization that extended far beyond the battlefield. Gunpowder production required reliable sources of sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal, leading to the development of mining operations and trade networks that spanned multiple domains. Lead for bullets had to be imported or extracted from domestic sources, creating opportunities for merchants who could navigate the complex political landscape of warring territories. The rhythm of their lives for countless individuals now revolved around the industrial requirements of gunpowder warfare rather than traditional agricultural cycles. Training regimens for Ashigaru units emphasized discipline and coordination over individual prowess, reflecting the fundamentally different nature of firearms combat compared to traditional samurai warfare. Large groups of soldiers learned to move in formation, loading and firing their weapons in coordinated volleys that could break cavalry charges and destroy enemy formations through concentrated firepower. The parade grounds where these drills took place echoed with the shouted commands of drill sergeants and the synchronized movements of hundreds of feet marching in unison. The social implications of this military revolution extended far beyond the battlefield. Peasant soldiers who proved themselves capable with firearms found opportunities for social advancement that had been virtually impossible under the traditional system. Some rose through the ranks to become officers or even low-ranking samurai, creating new pathways for mobility in a society that had previously been rigidly hierarchical. The crackling of musket fire thus became not just the sound of military innovation, but the herald of social transformation. Foreign observers who visited Japan during this period marveled at the speed with which the Japanese had not only adopted, but improved upon European military technology. Portuguese missionaries and Dutch traders wrote detailed accounts of battles where Japanese armies deployed thousands of arquebuses with a level of coordination and effectiveness that surpassed anything they had witnessed in European conflicts. The island nation that had once been isolated from global military developments was rapidly becoming one of the most technologically advanced military powers in the world. As the 1550s progressed, the strategic implications of widespread firearm adoption became increasingly apparent to military leaders throughout Japan. Traditional castle siege tactics that had relied on patient investment and occasional assault were being replaced by more aggressive approaches that leveraged the destructive power of concentrated gunfire. The siege engines and scaling ladders that had characterized earlier conflicts were giving way to earthworks and gun emplacements that could systematically reduce even the strongest fortifications to rubble. The transformation was not merely technological but philosophical, representing a fundamental shift in how Japanese society understood the relationship between social status and military effectiveness. The samurai ideals of individual honor and martial prowess were being challenged by military realities that favored discipline, coordination, and the effective use of increasingly sophisticated weapons systems. The rhythm of their lives, for warriors and civilians alike, was being synchronized to the irregular drumbeat of gunpowder warfare, setting the stage for conflicts that would dwarf even the devastating wars of the early Sengoku period. In the province of Owari, where morning mist rose from the Kiso River like the breath of sleeping dragons, a young man named Oda Nobunaga was preparing to shatter every convention that had governed Japanese warfare for the previous 1,000 years. Born in 1534 into a minor branch of a relatively modest samurai family, Nobunaga would grow to embody the ruthless pragmatism that characterized the most successful leaders of the Sengoku period. His domain, centered around the modest castle town of Nagoya, seemed an unlikely launching point for the conquest of all Japan. Yet it was precisely this humble beginning that would fuel his revolutionary approach to power. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Nagoya in the year 1551, when Nobunaga first inherited his father's modest holdings at the age of 17. The wooden buildings that lined the narrow streets were sturdy but unremarkable, their thatched roofs darkened by cooking smoke, and their walls weathered by countless seasons of rain and sun. The sound of daily commerce, merchants haggling over rice prices, blacksmiths hammering iron, and children playing in dusty courtyards, created the familiar symphony of a provincial castle town that differed little from dozens of others scattered throughout central Japan. Yet beneath this surface ordinariness, Nobunaga was already displaying the unconventional thinking that would make him the most feared name in Japan. While other young lords spent their time perfecting traditional martial arts and composing poetry in the classical manner, Nobunaga immersed himself in the practical details of administration, military logistics, and the revolutionary potential of firearms technology. His retainers often found him studying maps by candlelight, calculating distances between enemy strongholds and planning supply routes with the methodical precision of a master craftsman designing a complex piece of machinery. The first test of Nobunaga's leadership came not from external enemies, but from within his own family, as rival branches of the Oda clan challenged his right to inherit his father's position. These internal conflicts provided him with invaluable experience in the brutal realities of Sengoku politics, where blood relationships offered no protection against ambition, and survival often required the elimination of one's closest relatives. The sound of steel against steel in castle courtyards became as common as the morning calls of roosters, as brothers and cousins settled their disputes through combat rather than negotiation. Nobunaga's approach to these family conflicts revealed the calculating intelligence that would characterize his entire career. Rather than relying solely on traditional samurai loyalty or the prestige of his bloodline, he systematically identified which retainers could be trusted, which could be bought, and which needed to be eliminated before they became threats. The rhythm of their lives in Owari began to revolve around constant surveillance and careful positioning, as every conversation might reveal crucial intelligence, and every alliance could shift without warning. The decisive moment in Nobunaga's early career came with the Battle of Okahazama in 1560, where he would demonstrate the innovative tactical thinking that would make him legendary throughout Japan. His enemy, Imagawa Yoshimoto, commanded an army of 25,000 men and represented one of the most powerful clans in central Japan. Conventional wisdom suggested that Nobunaga, with his force of fewer than 3,000 warriors, should either seek terms of surrender or retreat to his strongholds and hope for relief from distant allies. Instead, Nobunaga chose a strategy so audacious that it bordered on madness. On a day when summer thunderstorms lashed the countryside with sheets of rain that reduced visibility to mere yards, he led a small strike force through mountain paths that most commanders would have considered impassable. The sound of rain drumming against armor and the squelch of sandals in mud provided cover for movements that brought his elite troops within striking distance of Imagawa's main camp while the enemy commander was conducting a victory celebration, confident that the weather made any attack impossible. The assault itself lasted less than an hour, but its psychological impact would resonate throughout Japan for decades. Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the most respected military leaders of his generation, was struck down in his own camp by warriors who had appeared like vengeful spirits from the storm. The head that had once commanded the loyalty of tens of thousands of samurai was severed from its body and presented to Nobunaga as proof that traditional military wisdom was no match for innovative thinking and perfect timing. The victory at Okahazama transformed Nobunaga from a minor provincial lord into a major player in the struggle for control of central Japan. More importantly, it established his reputation as a commander who would discard any tradition or convention that interfered with military effectiveness. Word of his unconventional tactics spread along the trade routes and military networks that connected the various domains, carried by merchants, wandering monks, and masterless samurai who had witnessed the aftermath of the battle. Nobunaga's subsequent consolidation of power in central Japan revealed an administrative genius that matched his military innovations. Where other daimyo ruled through traditional feudal relationships that bound lord and retainer through personal loyalty and hereditary obligation, Nobunaga began implementing systems based on merit, efficiency, and measurable results. His castle towns grew rapidly as he encouraged commerce and craftsmanship, understanding that economic prosperity would provide the resources necessary for his increasingly ambitious military campaigns. The free markets that Nobunaga established in his territories represented a radical departure from the guild-based commercial systems that had characterized Japanese trade for centuries. Merchants who had previously been restricted to specific goods or geographic areas now found themselves free to trade in any commodity and establish shops wherever opportunity beckoned. The jingling of coins in these expanding marketplaces created a new kind of music, one that harmonized economic opportunity with military necessity in ways that previous generations of leaders had never imagined. Perhaps most controversially, Nobunaga began recruiting Shigeru units not just from his own domains, but from among the masterless samurai, displaced farmers, and even religious outcasts who had been marginalized by traditional society. These men, bound to him by economic necessity rather than hereditary loyalty, proved to be fanatically devoted soldiers who would follow orders without the questioning or debate that sometimes characterized traditional samurai retainers. The rhythm of their lives became entirely synchronized with Nobunaga's military campaigns, their fortunes rising and falling with his success on the battlefield. The firearms units that formed the core of Nobunaga's military strength were organized with a precision that reflected his understanding of both technology and human psychology. His Shigeru were trained to load and fire in rotation, creating continuous volleys of musket fire that could devastate enemy formations while maintaining constant pressure on defensive positions. The smoke that rose from these concentrated firearm attacks created an artificial fog of war that often concealed the true size and disposition of his forces, allowing smaller armies to achieve effects that had previously required much larger conventional forces. Nobunaga's treatment of defeated enemies and rebellious subjects earned him the nickname Daimyo, or Demon Lord, a title that he seemed to embrace rather than reject. Unlike many of his contemporaries who sought to rule through a combination of fear and respect, Nobunaga appeared to believe that fear alone was sufficient to maintain order in a chaotic age. Entire communities that resisted his authority were put to the sword, their buildings burned and their fields salted to prevent future cultivation. The smoke that rose from these destroyed settlements served as visible warnings to other potential opponents that submission was the only alternative to annihilation. The religious policies that Nobunaga implemented throughout his expanding territories reflected his broader philosophy of eliminating any potential source of organized opposition to his authority. Buddhist monasteries that had accumulated political power were systematically destroyed, their warrior monks scattered or killed, and their vast landholdings redistributed to secular administrators. The morning prayers that had echoed from temple bells for centuries were replaced by the martial sounds of military drill and the construction of new fortifications. Yet for all his ruthlessness, Nobunaga also demonstrated a capacity for innovation and adaptation that extended far beyond military affairs. He encouraged technological development, supported new forms of artistic expression, and even showed interest in the European ideas and customs that were being introduced by Portuguese missionaries and traders. The rhythm of their lives in Nobunaga's territories began to include elements that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. Christian churches existing alongside Shinto shrines, European-style clothing worn by some members of the warrior class, and new architectural techniques that combined Japanese aesthetics with European engineering principles. By the 1570s, Nobunaga controlled a domain that stretched from the Pacific coast to the mountains of central Japan, and his armies were marching on the ancient capital of Kyoto with the stated goal of restoring order to the realm. The young provincial lord who had once struggled to maintain control over a few rice-producing valleys was now positioned to become the most powerful man in Japan, his revolutionary approach to warfare and governance having transformed him into a figure of almost mythical stature. The stage was set for conflicts that would determine whether traditional Japanese civilization would survive the tempest of change that he had unleashed upon the archipelago. The morning mist that rose from Lake Biwa in the autumn of 1571 carried with it the acrid scent of burning incense and the distant sound of chanting monks. But beneath these familiar elements of religious devotion lay an atmosphere of impending catastrophe that seemed to make the very air heavy with foreboding. On the slopes of Mount Hai, overlooking the ancient capital of Kyoto, the Enryakuji monastery complex stood like a sacred city unto itself, its hundreds of buildings connected by stone pathways that had been worn smooth by centuries of sandaled feet. Here, among temples that housed priceless Buddhist art and libraries containing the accumulated wisdom of generations, warrior monks prepared for a siege that would test whether spiritual conviction could withstand the methodical brutality of Nobunaga's war machine. Imagine yourself climbing the steep mountain paths that led to these monastery gates in those final peaceful days before the storm broke, your breath forming clouds in the crisp mountain air as you passed beneath towering cedar trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of emperors. The sound of wooden bells echoing across the valleys mixed with the more martial notes of weapons practice, as monks who had devoted their lives to contemplation and prayer now spent equal time mastering the arts of war. The rhythm of their lives had become a complex harmony of spiritual discipline and military preparation, with morning prayers followed by spear drill and evening meditation accompanied by the maintenance of firearms. The warrior monks of Mount Hai, known throughout Japan as Sohei, represented one of the most formidable military forces in the archipelago. Unlike the secular samurai who fought for land, gold, or glory, these religious warriors believed they were defending the very foundations of Buddhist civilization against a man they viewed as a demon sent to test their faith. Their shaved heads gleamed in the morning sun as they moved through combat formations with the same precision they brought to religious ceremonies, their naginata spears and arquebus muskets blessed by abbots who understood that survival required both divine favor and superior firepower. The monastery complexes that dotted the mountains around Kyoto had evolved over centuries into virtual fortress cities, each one capable of housing thousands of monks and supporting extensive military operations. The Ishiyama Honganji, built on a strategic height overlooking Osaka Bay, controlled river traffic and trade routes that were essential to the economic life of central Japan. Its thick walls, constructed from massive stones fitted together without mortar, could withstand conventional siege engines, while its position allowed defenders to rain arrows and musket balls down upon any attacking force. The sound of construction echoed constantly from these sacred fortresses as monks reinforced their defenses and prepared for the assault they knew must come. Nobunaga's decision to destroy the Buddhist military orders reflected both practical military necessity and a deeper philosophical conviction that religious institutions had no place in the secular political order he was creating. The monasteries controlled vast landholdings that could support his expanding armies, commanded the loyalty of millions of faithful believers who might resist his authority, and possessed military capabilities that rivaled those of major daimyo. More fundamentally, their claims to spiritual authority challenged his vision of a Japan unified under a single military leader who would brook no competing sources of power. The siege of Mount Hai began on a clear September morning when Nobunaga's forces surrounded the mountain complex with a precision that reflected months of careful planning. Unlike the dramatic cavalry charges and individual combat that characterized traditional Japanese warfare, this assault proceeded with the methodical efficiency of craftsmen dismantling a complex piece of machinery. Ashiguru units armed with arquebuses established firing positions that could sweep the monastery's approaches, while engineers began constructing the earthworks and palisades necessary for a prolonged siege. The sound that rose from the besieged monastery during those final days was unlike anything heard before in Japanese warfare. A mixture of Buddhist chanting, the clash of weapons, and the irregular cracking of gunfire that created an almost otherworldly symphony of destruction. Monks who had spent their lives copying sacred texts and composing poetry now found themselves loading muskets and preparing for a death that would either earn them martyrdom or demonstrate the futility of opposing Nobunaga's will. The rhythm of their lives, once governed by the ancient cycles of prayer and meditation, was now synchronized with the brutal tempo of siege warfare. When Nobunaga finally ordered the assault on Mount Hai, the attack proceeded with a thoroughness that shocked even his own followers. Every building was put to the torch. Every monk was killed regardless of age or willingness to surrender, and every sacred text was consigned to flames that could be seen from Kyoto itself. The smoke that rose from the burning monastery carried with it the ashes of centuries of Buddhist learning and artistic achievement, dispersing on the wind like the fragments of a civilization that was being systematically dismantled. The psychological impact of Mount Hai's destruction reverberated throughout Japan like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Religious communities that had considered themselves immune from secular warfare now understood that Nobunaga recognized no sanctuary and respected no tradition that interfered with his goals. The morning prayers that had once echoed from temple bells across the landscape were now accompanied by the sound of monks drilling with weapons and reinforcing defensive positions, as religious leaders prepared for conflicts that would determine the survival of Buddhism itself in Japan. The siege of Ishiyama Honganji, which began in 1570 and would continue for a full decade, represented the largest and most complex military operation of the entire Sengoku period. Unlike Mount Hai, which had been destroyed in a single devastating assault, the Honganji complex proved capable of sustained resistance that would test every aspect of Nobunaga's military innovations. The fortress monastery commanded approaches from both land and sea, possessed its own weapons manufacturing capabilities, and could draw upon the religious devotion of believers throughout Western Japan for both supplies and reinforcements. The warrior monks who defended Ishiyama Honganji had adapted to gunpowder warfare with the same enthusiasm that secular lords had shown for European military technology. Their workshops produced firearms that rivaled anything in Nobunaga's arsenals, while their tactical innovations in defensive warfare created new forms of fortification that combined traditional Japanese castle design with cutting-edge military engineering. The sound of hammering from these monastery workshops often continued through the night, as monks worked to produce the weapons and ammunition necessary for their survival. Naval warfare, which had played a relatively minor role in earlier Japanese conflicts, became central to the struggle for Ishiyama Honganji as both sides attempted to control the sea routes that provided access to the fortress. Nobunaga commissioned the construction of massive ironclad warships armed with cannons, vessels that represented the marriage of European naval technology with Japanese craftsmanship and innovation. The sound of these ships' cannons echoing across Osaka Bay created a new form of martial music, one that announced the arrival of warfare on a scale that previous generations could never have imagined. The common people caught between these opposing forces found their lives disrupted in ways that went far beyond the familiar hardships of traditional warfare. Villages that had provided rice and other supplies to Buddhist monasteries for centuries now faced demands from secular lords who required provisions for armies that dwarfed anything seen in earlier conflicts. The rhythm of their lives, once synchronized with agricultural seasons and religious festivals, was increasingly dictated by the logistics of prolonged siege warfare that consumed resources on an unprecedented scale. The engineering innovations that emerged from these extended sieges would influence military thinking throughout East Asia for generations to come. Nobunaga's forces developed new techniques for undermining fortress walls, creating artificial rivers to flood defensive positions, and coordinating artillery bombardments with infantry assaults. The monasteries responded with equally innovative defensive measures, including underground tunnels, concealed firing positions, and early warning systems that could alert defenders to approaching attacks while they were still miles away. The religious dimension of these conflicts added layers of complexity that went far beyond mere military considerations. Many of Nobunaga's own followers were devout Buddhists who found themselves torn between loyalty to their lord and horror at his systematic destruction of sacred sites. Some secretly provided intelligence to besieged monasteries, while others openly defected to join the religious resistance. The sound of prayer wheels spinning in hidden shrines mixed with the clash of arms as individuals struggled to reconcile spiritual conviction with political reality. As the siege of Ishiyama Honganji dragged on through the 1570s, it became clear that this conflict represented more than a simple military campaign. It was a fundamental struggle over the nature of Japanese civilization itself. Would the future belong to Nobunaga's vision of rational, centralized authority that subordinated all other considerations to military effectiveness? Or would traditional religious and cultural values prove capable of surviving the assault of his revolutionary approach to power? The smoke that rose from burning temples and the echo of gunfire from sacred mountains provided a constant reminder that the answer to this question would determine the fate of millions of people whose lives hung in the balance. The decade-long siege would test not only military capabilities, but the very foundations of belief systems that had shaped Japanese society for over 1,000 years. In mountain monasteries and castle towns, in farming villages and merchant quarters, people watched and waited to see whether spiritual conviction could withstand the methodical application of superior firepower, and whether the ancient rhythm of their lives could survive the transformation that Nobunaga was imposing upon the archipelago. In the mountain castle of Takeda Shingen, where winter snows could isolate the domain for months at a time, an aging warlord sat in meditation before a scroll that contained the accumulated wisdom of generations of warriors who had faced death with courage and honor. The year was 1572, and Shingen understood that his long rivalry with Oda Nobunaga was approaching its climax, yet his thoughts dwelt not on tactical advantages or strategic positioning, but on the deeper questions of what it meant to be a samurai in an age when traditional values were being tested by revolutionary changes in warfare and society. The soft sound of snowflakes against paper screens provided a gentle counterpoint to his contemplation, while the distant practicing of his retainers with sword and spear reminded him that philosophical reflection must always be balanced with practical preparation for battle. Imagine yourself walking through the corridors of a traditional samurai residence during this period, your feet silent on tatami mats that bore the faint scent of fresh straw, while sliding doors opened to reveal rooms where warriors gathered to discuss not merely military matters, but the ethical foundations of their calling. The conversations that echoed through these spaces dealt with questions that had taken on new urgency in an era of constant warfare. How should a warrior conduct himself when facing enemies who showed no respect for traditional codes of honor? What obligations did a samurai owe to a lord who demanded actions that violated ancient customs? How could one maintain spiritual purity while participating in conflicts that required increasing levels of violence and destruction? The development of what would later be codified as bushido, the way of the warrior, was not a sudden revelation, but rather the gradual crystallization of ideas that had been evolving throughout the chaos of the Sengoku period. Warriors who had witnessed the transformation of Japanese society under the pressure of constant conflict found themselves compelled to articulate principles that could provide guidance in situations their ancestors had never faced. The rhythm of their lives now included not only physical training and military service, but also philosophical discussions and literary pursuits that aimed to define the essential nature of the warrior's path. The tea ceremony, which had previously been primarily an aesthetic pursuit of court nobles and wealthy merchants, was adopted by samurai as a means of cultivating the mental discipline and emotional control necessary for effective leadership in battle. In tea houses built within castle compounds, warriors learned to find moments of tranquility amid the chaos of military campaigns, their movements becoming as precise and deliberate as the choreographed steps of traditional dance. The sound of water boiling in iron kettles and the gentle whisper of bamboo whisks mixing powdered tea created islands of calm in lives otherwise dominated by the harsh realities of warfare. The influence of Zen Buddhism on samurai philosophy deepened during this period, as warriors sought spiritual frameworks that could help them face death without fear while maintaining clarity of thought in the midst of battle. Monastery gardens within castle grounds became places where samurai could practice meditation between military campaigns, their raked gravel and carefully placed stones serving as visual representations of the order and discipline they sought to cultivate within themselves. The sound of wooden clappers calling monks to prayer often mingled with the clash of practice, swords as warriors sought to integrate spiritual development with martial training. Poetry composition, particularly in the 31-syllable tanka form, became an essential accomplishment for samurai who wished to be considered cultured and refined. Warriors would gather in the evening after long days of military planning to share verses that captured their thoughts on mortality, duty, and the transient beauty of the natural world. The scratch of brushes on rice paper and the soft murmur of voices reciting classical poetry created a soundscape that contrasted sharply with the martial atmosphere that dominated most aspects of samurai life. Yet these artistic pursuits were considered essential for developing the sensitivity and emotional depth that distinguished true warriors from mere soldiers. The concept of loyalty, which had always been central to samurai identity, underwent significant evolution during the Sengoku period as traditional feudal bonds were tested by the practical necessities of survival in a fragmented political landscape. Warriors found themselves forced to choose between personal honor and family survival, between loyalty to individual lords and service to abstract ideals of justice or national unity. The conflicts that arose from these impossible choices created a rich literature of moral philosophy that would influence Japanese thought for centuries to come. The practice of seppuku, ritual suicide, took on new dimensions during this period as warriors developed elaborate protocols for maintaining honor even in defeat or disgrace. The ceremonies surrounding these acts became highly refined rituals that demonstrated the participants' commitment to values that transcended mere physical survival. The The sound of the final breath leaving a warrior's lips was often accompanied by the recitation of death poems that had been composed specifically for the occasion, their words serving as final testimony to a life lived according to demanding moral principles. Training regimens for young samurai expanded beyond mere martial skills to include calligraphy, mathematics, history, and classical literature, reflecting the growing understanding that leadership in the complex political environment of the Sengoku period required intellectual capabilities that matched physical prowess. The rhythm of their lives became a carefully balanced combination of physical conditioning, weapons practice, scholarly study, and artistic pursuits that aimed to develop complete human beings rather than simple fighting machines. The relationship between samurai and their weapons evolved during this period into something approaching religious devotion, with swords being treated as sacred objects that embodied the spiritual essence of their owners. The forging of a katana became a ritual process that could take months to complete, with smiths observing periods of purification and prayer as they shaped steel that had been folded thousands of times to achieve perfect strength and flexibility. The sound of hammer on anvil in sword-making workshops took on an almost musical quality as craftsmen sought to create weapons that were as much works of art as they were instruments of war. The architectural evolution of samurai residences during this period reflected changing attitudes toward the balance between military necessity and aesthetic refinement. Castle compounds began to include elaborate gardens, tea houses, and libraries that served as spaces for cultural pursuits, while defensive features were integrated into the overall design in ways that maintained both beauty and functionality. The sound of water flowing through carefully designed streams and the rustle of wind through artfully planted bamboo groves created environments where warriors could cultivate the inner peace necessary for effective decision-making under pressure. The emergence of written codes of conduct during this period represented attempts by various daimyo to articulate the standards they expected from their retainers. These documents, often called house laws or family precepts, detailed everything from proper behavior in battle to appropriate conduct during peacetime, creating formal frameworks for warrior behavior that had previously been transmitted through oral tradition and personal example. The scratch of brushes recording these laws created permanent records of evolving standards that reflected the increasing complexity of samurai society. Female members of samurai families played crucial roles in maintaining and transmitting the cultural values that defined warrior society. While men were often absent on military campaigns, women managed household affairs, supervised the education of children, and preserved the artistic and literary traditions that were considered essential elements of refined samurai culture. The sound of koto strings being plucked in family quarters and the soft voices of mothers teaching classical poetry to their children created the cultural foundation upon which martial excellence could be built. The practice of adopting promising warriors from lower social classes into samurai families became increasingly common during this period, creating new pathways for social mobility, while ensuring that warrior culture could attract and retain the most capable individuals regardless of their birth circumstances. These adoption ceremonies, which involved elaborate rituals designed to formally transfer family identity and obligations, created bonds that were considered stronger than blood relationships and helped maintain the vitality of samurai society during a period of rapid change. The influence of firearms on samurai culture created tensions that were resolved through the development of new philosophical frameworks that emphasized adaptability while maintaining core values. Warriors learned to see technological innovation as merely another tool for expressing timeless principles of courage, loyalty, and self-sacrifice, allowing them to embrace new military capabilities without abandoning the spiritual foundations of their identity. The sound of musket practice became as much a part of castle life as sword training, yet both activities were understood as means of cultivating the warrior spirit rather than ends in themselves. As the 1570s progressed toward their tumultuous conclusion, the various strands of samurai philosophy were beginning to weave together into a coherent worldview that would provide guidance for warriors navigating the complex challenges of a rapidly changing world. The principles being developed during this period of chaos and transformation would eventually be codified into formal systems of thought that would influence Japanese society long after the Sengoku period had ended. The rhythm of their lives, once disrupted by constant warfare and social upheaval, was finding new patterns that balanced traditional values with innovative approaches to the fundamental questions of how to live and die with honor in an uncertain world. If you're still awake, then I'd wonder why. Let me know in the comments why. Maybe you'd need a more gentle, soothing sound. Well, hopefully next time. Next time, we'll venture somewhere new. Perhaps we'll explore the hidden rituals of ancient civilizations, or maybe we'll uncover the secrets buried in forgotten libraries. Until then, carry with you this reminder. Every comfort you enjoy, every freedom you take for granted, was paid for by countless generations who endured far more than we'll ever know. Sweet dreams if you can manage them. And remember, the past is always watching, always whispering its lessons to those brave enough to listen.